the 175th anniversary of the founding of the University of Westminster. 175th. Now, I could elaborate on this, but probably for the purposes of this conference, there's a rather more significant 175th anniversary. So you'll all be familiar with one other thing that happened in 1838 in Britain, which was the publication of the People's Charter. And the People's Charter, as you will know, was the foundation of one of the great early protest movements, the Chartist movement. And the publication of the People's Charter in 1838, I think, gives us the whole story of the relationship between protest and the media. Because on the one hand, we have the reaction of the established media, including the newly established media of the Manchester bourgeoisie, the Manchester Guardian, which described the People's Charter. And as you know, the People's Charter argued for annual parliaments, for universal manhood suffrage, and so on. It described the demand for universal suffrage, this is the Manchester Guardian, as something that would give the vote to every drunkard and blackguard in the kingdom. So a rather hostile line of the established media to protest in 1838. I think a theme that we may find in some aspects of this conference. On the other hand, a critical welcome to the People's Charter was given by another paper, very newly established, only less than a year old. And it criticised it from a different point of view because it didn't think it was radical enough. And that paper was the Northern Star. And the Northern Star indicates the other side of the relationship of media to protest, in that the Northern Star went on to be the backbone of the Chartist movement for the following decade. Most academic conferences, people are a bit distanced from the subject that they're discussing. My guess is, and it may be purely a guess, is that there are quite a lot of people in this conference who don't simply have an academic interest in media and protest. And I remember one of my first experiences of media and protest was 45 years ago in 1968. There were, when we were organising coaches to the big Vietnam Solidarity Campaign demonstration in London in October '68. And it shows something about the staffing of newspapers in those days that Fleet Street, as then was, managed to actually put some journalists on some of the coaches. I don't think that they would have enough staff to do that these days. And I was going to say surprised. Actually, I wasn't surprised because I already realised these things could happen. I was amused to find myself in the following day's papers quoted Peter Goodwin from Oxford as saying that the reason I was going on this demonstration was for violence. Yeah? And again, I think a theme that may come out in the current conference. So I'd like to welcome you all very much to this conference on protest and the media. And it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Nick Couldry, who says that under no circumstances must I plug his latest book, Media, Society and the World. Yes, he's sitting here in embarrassment. Media, Society and the World, which is worth reading not merely in and of itself, but also it contains material very relevant to the talk he's about to give. Nick is Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths College and Director of, Joint Director of the Department of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths at the moment. He says he's very happy there, but in September he's going on to be professor at the London School of Economics. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nick, who's going to talk about digital media and the production of collectivity. He's going to talk for about 45 minutes, which will leave plenty of room for questions and discussion afterwards. Nick.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Peter. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be asked to open this conference on one of the most enticing titles that I've heard for a while, so I'm really pleased to be here. And thanks to Anastasia and all the other organizers. I'm going to draw on the argument of part of my recent book, Media Society, well, particularly chapter 5, although I'll be extending it in various ways. And I'm going to try and rehearse an argument about the relation between digital media and political and social change. We live, obviously, at a time of great excitement about new forms of politics and activism, which we believe have strong links of some sort to new media forms. But we also live at a time of great uncertainty about the preconditions of political action and engagement. Real uncertainty about how we can understand anymore the connections between politics and the social. Let's take as a given the importance of recent political movements such as the Arab Spring in its various forms, Occupy, Indignados, and so on. But since this is a conference of scholars and activists who care deeply about getting the analysis right, I want to move more slowly here in asking how exactly we should understand the importance of events and movements such as those, drawing on what sorts of resource from social theory and empirical investigation, drawing on what sorts of frameworks of comparison for understanding the relations between media and protest, between media and possibilities of political transformation. Many argue that digital media, particularly social networking platforms, enable quicker mobilization, accelerated protest, indeed new forms of collectivity that just didn't exist before. And I'm not going to disagree with that. Going public was once a major effort. It's now just a click away. So too it seems with going public together, acting in public together. Everyone here, myself included, must be excited by that possibility. But how are we to evaluate that possibility? How are we to weigh it against other important factors, long-term structural forces in the political domain, perhaps other less noticed features of the digital age and digital platforms that may be working silently against that possibility? That's what I want to explore in my talk. Let me start with a strange gap that emerges when we look closely at some of even the very best recent writing on politics and cultural production, on online networking and the conditions of democracy. Yochai Beckler, in The Wealth of Networks, argues that in the digital age, the economics of cultural production have been fundamentally altered. He writes that the high capital costs that were a prerequisite to gathering, working, and communicating information, knowledge, and culture have now been widely distributed in the society. That's his phrase. In other words, the entry barrier to getting involved in cultural production of all sorts is reduced, so new types of cultural production network can emerge. New forms of what he calls cooperation and sharing. While, as Benkler emphasizes, all this happens alongside the continuance of market-based media structures, that doesn't dim his vision that we have available to us now a completely new model of how to make meaning. He writes that we have an opportunity to change the way we create and exchange information, knowledge, and culture. And that's in part because the enhanced ability to link up knowledge resources online enables very large tasks, such as political mobilization, to be broken down into smaller tasks to which individuals and small groups can contribute wherever they are. And this modularization makes possible, as Andrew Chadwick argues, completely new opportunities for people to contribute to larger political processes. Certainly, as Benkler shows in a number of examples, and I won't go through his examples, you're probably familiar with them, new types of interruptive political action are easier now. But there are some problems with this argument. As Clay Shirky argues in his book Cognitive Surplus, a book I prefer to his previous one, Here Comes Everybody, not my favorite book, but Cognitive Surplus is a more subtle, carefully argued book. In that book, he says there has to be a motive for participating in new types of media production. There has to be a sustained need. The habits of data sharing that are now evolving online will not, Shirky argues, generate real public and civic value, his phrase, automatically, without some wider transformations in people's motivations, their resources, their needs. And those transformations are not a given. And while the internet's improved infrastructure for what Benkler calls social production practices, for sure creates enough of a context for short-term political action, the consequences for wider democracy over the longer term are much less clear. Yes, as French political sociologist Pierre Rosanvallon argues, the repertoire of counter-democracy has increased. That is, the politics of opposition and rejection. But what about positive political action, policy promotion, policy implementation? What are the social and political forms that make those sorts of action possible, and have they been transformed by digital media, and for better or for worse? This takes us to the issues raised by Manuel Castell's work, very well known in communication and social theory. In his book, Communication Power from 2009, Castells argues that in recent decades, the organization of society and politics has changed radically and needs to be understood from two new directions. First, by understanding the emergence of networks, which determine the distribution of resources and provide now a fabric that connects people across all boundaries. And second, by tracking the construction of meaning within and across those networks. Because, as he rightly argues, power always needs to be legitimated. It has to be culturally translated if it's to work. Now, the importance of that first point is not in doubt. Of course, networks have emerged and are important. But it's the relation of the first to the second point that is problematic. In other words, how exactly do the conditions of meaning necessary for democratic politics change in what Castells calls a network society? Again, there are some problems here in his account which flow from gaps in Castells' account of the network society. One relates to the issue of time. Castells shows conclusively that how the spatial flow of meanings in media networks, the flow of resources in financial and other networks, how they disrupt purely national politics. But how in a network society, and I'll question that term in a moment, how in such a society should we think about the contexts and resources needed to sustain political mobilization in time? We would all acknowledge, no doubt, the role which Castells emphasizes of online communication, social media, in the Obama presidential campaign of 2008. But then we also have to think about the collapse of that popular campaign once Obama was elected. What was the role of social media there? In addition, we need to remember that governments are networked too. They too increasingly operate as complex networks of networks, with vast data sets at their disposal. What is the significance of that for democracy over the longer term? Castells' network society theory, I think, provides a very useful account of the importance of networks in social, political, and economic organization. But it's his concept of society that remains surprisingly underdeveloped. Indeed, close to metaphorical, I think. At one point, Castells asked, rather charmingly, you might say, could it be that the technological and organizational transformation of the network society provides the material and cultural basis for the anarchist utopia of network self-management to become a social practice? Nice question. I respect Castells for asking it. That's the remarkable tension in his work, that he feels the need to ask these great questions, which have a longer history to them. But the question leaves other questions unanswered, such as, what is a social practice in Castells' view? Are horizontal networks in themselves already equivalent to the social? If yes, what exactly is it that qualifies them as a social practice? How do they relate to other types of thick social contexts that we encounter? If not, where else are the social practices that Castells has in mind? There's a risk, I think, in talking about networks that the social gets bypassed altogether. I know I'm not the first to point this out. Indeed, Castells himself insisted in 1996 in his book, The Rise of the Network Society, that, quotes, people, locales, and activities lose their structural meaning in a network society. But if that's true, what are the long-term contexts that sustain individual action? For sure, the individual cannot put these together herself. The network is not always there when the individual acts or contemplates whether to act. As Danilo Martuchelli argues in his book La consistance du social from 2005, the notion of flow for Castells seems to replace any substantive account of social life. And this is a real problem for understanding what's going on with politics and activism in a digital age. And this problem of a disappearing social characterizes other writers too. Let's take sophisticated, admirable critics like Hart and Negri, who in their book Multitude reject the idea of a unified social body, but then invoke a sort of new social whose features remain entirely undefined. They write, what we experience in our postmodern society, that's their phrase, is a kind of social flesh. A flesh that is not a body, a flesh that is common living substance. The flesh of the multitude is pure potential, an unformed life force, and in this sense, I'm not really sure in what that sense is, but in this sense, an element of social being, aimed constantly at the fullness of life. Now, what's missing in that sentence, much more drastically than in Castells, is a sense of the specific resources, the specific action contexts, and opportunity structures required for sustained political mobilization. Metaphor is not good enough. As soon as then we look closely at even the very best accounts of how the digital world is changing our possibilities of action, political action, we run into a gap, both in the theory and in the evidence. And we can sum up this problem in a few key questions to which we need answers, whether we're doing research or whether we're working as reflective activists. Question one is, what is the social implied in today's digital transformations? What basis does it have in institutional resources and structures? Because surely politics can't happen without some sustained resource, and that generally means institutional resources of some kind. And then there's a second question we need to answer somehow, which is, if we assume that the digital really is transforming the social in general terms, it's changing the ground of politics, and maybe it is, then we have to ask who now is able to act with who, sustainably and effectively. We're not just interested in incidental actions, sustainably and effectively in ways that they really couldn't before. And because things are never simple, there are always counter-forces, we have to ask a third question. What are the forces that act against the sustainability of those digital resources and those new contexts for political action? Huge questions, obviously. If we were going to answer them, we need a lot of researchers in the room, including some political scientists. We have some, luckily today, and I'm not a political scientist. I don't claim to be. I just ask awkward questions from off stage, so you have to forgive me. But let me run through some aspects of those questions that I think we would all agree are important to consider. I'll go through them in turn, but they're going to be who can be political actors today, what sorts of resource do they need, how is the intensity of political and public life now changing, and how are our basic forms of being together also changing. We'll start with political actors. There's no doubt that an online infrastructure makes possible a much larger set of political actors than before. Public politics is no longer restricted to mainstream political institutions and their representatives. Individuals without parties can be political actors. For example, solo bloggers Matt Drudge in the States, Guido Fawkes in the UK. And of course, network actors become possible. That is, distributed agents of political coordination that link multiple persons, groups, positions across space without any need for a physical headquarters or a bounded membership. But a number of questions emerge. First of all, which type of actors tend to become powerful under digital conditions? Answering this means understanding how exactly individual and group actors come together online to shape common action. Or, put another way, how are they articulated together into longer chains of action? Because without those chains, that's a term I borrow from Bruno Latour, new actors will not draw others in. They won't become recognized as actors, as stable actors on the political stage. The key point, as we found in the public connection study that I led at LSE between 2003 and 2006, is the old cultural studies term of articulation. What actions regularly get connected or articulated to what other actions? And just as important, what actions regularly do not get connected up in this way, but just stay isolated, inert, ineffective. We then have to ask what causes or generates articulation in this sense. And I think, honestly, I hope it's not embarrassing, but I think the sharpest recent contribution on this point is by Lance Bennett and Alexandra Segerberg, who in an article last year in Information Communication Society argued that social media platforms enable a new logic of connective as opposed to collective action. This derives, they argue, from the personal, or at least the personalized, nature of the invitations, the information distributions that occur via those platforms. It's a very interesting suggestion, precisely because it looks for a sociological cause of recent forms of network action and their effectiveness. For example, the Occupy, the 15M in Spain, and so on. Now, presumably the idea is, I hope I've got this right, that such actions depend for their mobilizing force on something like personal capital. And so they bypass the disincentives that often stop people taking part in actions organized by conventional political institutions, parties, lobby groups, and so on. And I'm going to come back to this idea later, but for now I just want to suggest that it might be as much the lack of any apparent connection to long-term institutional politics as the positive force of personal connection that makes the difference here. But then let's think about what happens when there is no articulation. Then what seems like activism on a small scale, on the ground, becomes what Canadian analyst Maria Bakajeva calls sub-activism, locally contextualized action that never gets linked up to policy making and formal institutional politics, remains isolated in its original context. There's nothing wrong with that, you might say, but it's surely something we have to think about. We need to think about the regular connections from a local action beyond that first context if we are seriously interested in how the digital enables new forms of political transformation. We can also ask, what are elites up to in the middle of all this change? Well, of course, they are networking and blogging too. the sheer difficulty of converting an online presence into visibility beyond a small local circle makes all too plausible Matthew Hinman's assessment of blogs as, quotes, the new elite media. We might make the same argument for Twitter too, as the new elite media. In other words, we may be looking most of the time in the wrong place when we analyze Twitter and blogs. So to sum up, there are forces of hierarchy within the apparent multiplication of political actors online. Let's now turn to resources. There's no doubt that in an online world, basic information and more complex types of information resource, data sets, platform designs, and so on, all of them can be shared much more effectively and quicker than ever before. That means that more resources are available for quick-fire mobilization when there is an urgent political need. Longer-term political campaigning, however, requires more sustained resources, not necessarily of the traditional sort, i.e. the old-style political party, but at the very least, a sustained context and opportunity structure in which individuals can make sense of devoting their scarce time and energies to a campaign. Usually, at least in the past, that's been because an institutional structure of some sort has enough legitimacy to provide that sustained context for action. And this is where some really difficult questions begin. On the one hand, as Andrew Chadwick puts it, the internet offers political elites many opportunities to intensify and diversify the ways in which they sustain themselves in political power. End of quote. But meanwhile, in an age when leaking of documents is easy, just to click on the send button, all political institutions become more porous, more open to disruption across their boundaries. Bruce Bimber argues that the one consequence of the new information abundance is that well-established political institutions' chances for sustaining performance across events and issues becomes not easier but more difficult. And if that's true, how much more difficult does it become to establish a new political institution today that will acquire stably the authority to support sustained programs of political transformation? Then what about the intensity of contemporary digital life? What difference does that make here? The hugely increased possibilities of speaking, making, distributing cultural material for sure create a super-saturated environment of media consumption. Indeed, that's the main larger theme of my last book. And under that super-saturated environment, on the face of it, individuals are ever less likely to pick out a particular theme for attention and engagement, whatever theme it might be. As political scientist Danilo Zolo pointed out in his book, Democracy and Complexity, nearly 2 decades ago, the difficulty of getting any form of attention for any particular message increases as media outputs increase. And that must mean that the likelihood of people focusing on any specific political matter is, on average, reduced, let alone the likelihood of getting people to give their sustained attention to long-term policy development that requires continuous attention over time, rather than just, let's say, a short-term political scandal. In an age of accelerated information flows, then, our attention, Bimber argues, is more likely to be focused on short-term, event-based loyalties rather than longer-term, interest-based political affiliation. But maybe there's hope. Clay Shirky argues that if we all stopped watching TV, we'd have more time to pay attention to the welter of political communication now available somewhere online. It's a very nice idea. The only problem is that TV viewing has been increasing, not decreasing, in the US, America, Britain, Germany, and elsewhere for at least a decade, increasing. And even where consumption for old media is definitely falling, as in with newspapers in most countries, the implications for alternative sources of political news are not necessarily positive. In a fine recent study of news production and audiences in Argentina, Pablo Boskovsky shows that the vast majority of the Argentinian news audience read no blogs or online commentary. They barely do more than glance at the headlines on their homepage, leaving the news links unclicked. I'll return later to this question of attention because I think it's fundamental. And then, since politics is fundamentally a form of collective action, we also have to think about how a digital age might have changed the quality of how we come together, our ways of being together. And no one would doubt that social media have made possible new ways of being together, even if they were anticipated in principle by the way people were already using their mobile phones to keep in continuous touch with large numbers of people. But another important dimension to social media is surveillance. Surveillance by the social platforms that seek to profit from our coming together, of course, and also by the governments that may or may not lurk behind those social media platforms, as we've been finding out in the past few days, but also surveillance through our own actions in our constantly updated social leisure and consumption environment, a process that Mark Andreevich calls covalence. Remember, there have always been social pressures that have operated against transformative political action, against taking political risks. I think it's difficult to argue that those pressures have reduced in an age of social media and covalence. Surely they've increased, and that's without even considering governmental and corporate surveillance. And then there's the sheer amount of time that it requires to keep up with an environment supersaturated with the media of one's friends and acquaintances. Not entirely joking, we might, remembering Marx's great phrase about the dull compulsion of economic life, give it a contemporary twist and talk of the dull compulsion of media-saturated life, a compulsion that leaves us with so little time for anything else, including, for most of us, for politics, perhaps. So there are many overlapping factors involved in the relations between politics, media, and social life. And it's difficult, therefore, to see where we're going here. It's really hard. For sure, the space of potential political action is now more extended, it's better resourced than in the pre-digital age. And because this is true, whether we happen to own individually our phone and so on, or whether we share it, those benefits can apply to a wide range of countries, richer or poorer, especially at times of collective mobilization, as of course in the Arab Spring. But if we look closely, the mobilizations that we're discussing tend generally to be the sort of negative political interruptions that, as I mentioned, Rosanvallon calls counter-democracy. Bringing down a politician, revealing a scandal, blocking a policy. We have to look much harder, I think, to find examples of long-term processes of policy building that have emerged online. Meanwhile, for reasons just discussed, long-term strategies, long-term institutional building for positive politics are also more constrained. And social media are an effective mechanism for social surveillance, a point I'll come back to. So the first paradox that I want to bring out here is that notwithstanding the increased digital resources for political action, digitization's consequences for everyday politics, the slow, unexciting process that Rosanvallon calls ordinary democracy, they're radically uncertain. They can't be read off from the high points of revolutionary fervor any more than the political innovations of 1789 could tell us much about the everyday politics of the 1830s France. A second politics is that the most exciting recent political innovation is one that drew on the resources of traditional pre-digital politics. Occupy was certainly a digitally supported movement. its basic repertoire of actions was picked up around the world very fast through digital circulation. It came to influence commentary even in the Financial Times and other mainstream media sites. Although it may be fair to say that it's only marginally changed what governments have done in the years since, but at the time there seemed almost a possibility it could even be affecting those agendas. But what was the action repertoire of Occupy? It was the traditional political protests of people coming together in a symbolically significant place, in New York, just outside the Wall Street Stock Exchange, in London, outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and so on. Indeed, in this sense, Occupy was more traditional than the meetings in the Chiapas jungle staged by the Zapatistas in the mid-1990s that drew media out of their normal locations without telling them where they were going. And these occupations were special because they enabled face-to-face political debate and mutual political education. Occupy, I believe, was very important, but its importance lay in an attempt to rediscover the general will, Rousseau's engine of democracy, to rediscover it not entirely, at least, online, but crucially in part in face-to-face discussion, even if most people in those discussions no doubt had a smartphone. So I'm skeptical, much as I admire his previous work, about Jeffrey Duris's suggestion in a recent piece on Occupy that there is a logic of aggregation at work on platforms such as Twitter. For sure, if you're trying to get people to aggregate at high speed in a central place, the sheer semantic economy of microblogging platforms has real advantages. But for this, the action of gathering must already have made sense to those coming together, which, in the cases Duris discussed, depended on the general nature of the issues about the state and the body politic that were being raised, and the long history of gatherings at symbolic centres since at least the late 18th century, which everyone is familiar with. It's worth remembering that the largest aggregation for political purposes, possibly in history, was the worldwide protests against the impending Iraq War on 15th February 2003. On one view, at least 2 million people were gathered here, right here, in the centre of London. And this great protest relied on websites, the amplificatory effects of mass media, predating social media entirely. So far, I've been questioning the concept of the social in accounts of media and protest and the digital, and then I've moved on to question the idea that there's something intrinsic to platforms themselves, and I stress that themselves. I'm not saying platforms are not important, but in the platforms themselves that aids politics and democracy. And then there's a third complication in thinking through the consequences of digital media for political transformation, which I think is of particular interest to us as media researchers, if you're a media researcher here, as I am. And it's this I want to focus on in the last few minutes of my talk. And this takes me to my title, Who Are We? I've already started to cast doubt on the idea that there's any logic supportive of political action associated with particular communication networks or platforms. That's a broad sociological point, if you like. You may or may not agree with me. But it links to a point specific to media discourse, which is that we have to be really careful in taking literally what media institutions say we are doing. That's not simply because there's a lot of hype around new platforms, their transformative potential. Well, that's for sure something to be careful about. There's a deeper, more historical reason for being cautious, and that is that media institutions, since the early days of newspapers, film, radio, TV, long before the internet and mobile phones, media institutions have always been heavily engaged in discourse about the collectivities they bring together. Since the beginning of media, there's been a banal commercial side to this. As Dallas Smythe pointed out decades ago, media very often exists to sell audiences to advertisers. But the issue goes even deeper. Publicly funded media that are not funded by advertising have also always talked about the audiences they reach. The founder of the BBC, John Reith, just after its creation, wrote a book called Broadcast Over Britain that described the BBC's ability to bring together a national audience. For example, through the time signal that was broadcast less than a mile from here in Broadcasting House. That was his pitch to try and get the government to fund the BBC in 1924, when it was still a private corporation. And as modern media institutions strengthened over time, their outputs and rhythms became embedded in citizens' daily habits, and so turned into an essential tool in the professional practices of politicians and civil society organizations. Indeed, of any organization with a public role. So the idea became established over time that media literally are an entry point to what whole societies are thinking. And when I say idea, I mean a pattern in the organization of our practices that we can express as an idea, but is more simply based in what we do. That's ideology in Zizek's sense, as something we do, whether we think ironically about it or not. In my earlier work, I called that idea the myth of the mediated center. And just to sum up, that's a double myth. First, the myth that large, complex societies actually have a center of value, a central truth that can be expressed. And second, the myth that the very particular limited institutions we call media, institutions that just happen to have the power to represent society as a whole to its members, that those institutions are really a privileged access point to that societal center. The idea that media give us access to what's going on for us as a society at a particular time is so deeply entrenched that it's difficult to imagine media without it. Sometimes media researchers have literally written as if the myth were true, as if media literally are society. Here's the fine researcher of media and sport and media events, Michael Reel, who, perhaps in an unguarded moment, early in one of his books in 1989, wrote that media are the central nervous system of modern society, the center of all that is life in 20th century, our media, ourselves. But that is a risky move for an academic to make, when media depends so much and precisely for their legitimacy as institutions on this claim that they really do represent us. And now this claim is under threat. In the age of multiplying media interfaces and platforms, declining primetime audiences, huge competition for audience attention, radically uncertain economic models for media, at the same time as multiple possibilities for mass self-broadcasting, as Castells rightly calls it, in the digital age, which has all those properties, the need to reproduce the myth of the mediated center, I think, intensifies. It doesn't fall away. And many other types of institutions are involved in this struggle to ensure that something like a central role for media institutions will continue. Governments need that. Civil society actors of many sorts. All sorts of corporation which need ways of reaching advertising audiences. A great deal depends on media institutions continuing to have this central, so-called central role. But increasingly, the claim to speak for, to reach us, is also taking a new form. And this is emerging not so much in mass media, through the outputs of those who want a mass audience, but in social media. Social media, as Joseph Thoreau discusses in his recent book, The Daily You, which I strongly recommend, social media are based, of course, on a completely different economic logic from mass media. Even though they operate on a huge scale, perhaps even a larger scale than mass media. Facebook claimed in March this year 1.1 billion members. No doubt it's higher as we speak today. That new logic of social media, as we know, involves targeting individuals, drawing them into regular interactions with other individuals that they choose. And more subtly, it involves gathering and selling uniquely identifying data generated by those individuals as they interact with their friends. Data that can then be linked up to other data about their unique trajectories across online content. In this process, the places where we share material with those closest to us are very far from being our place, our genuine home page. As Joseph Thoreau puts it, the centrality of corporate power is a direct reality at the very heart of the digital age. There's also, however, something quite strange about this process, however remorseless the economic logic that certainly is driving it, because it's a process that is generating money for those with the best data, the best cookies, the best ways of processing and amalgamating large bundles of data, so as to target adverts on particular individuals. You might think there's a radical economic revolution underway. Look at the valuations on the stock market of Facebook and so on. But in fact, these changes do not represent a fundamental advance in what human beings are capable of that led to economic advances in previous generations. There's nothing comparable here with the invention of the telephone, the computer, the radio. We're just looking at a change in how certain businesses can market themselves more effectively to an existing audience. Indeed, as the American economist Robert Gordon has recently argued, there are good reasons to think that the productivity and economic gains from IT and computer-mediated communication peaked some time ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago, and that there have only been minor economic gains since the early labor savings from computerization. Social media enterprises then involve dividing up the benefits, not from revolutionary new modes of economic production, as we're often told, but much less radically from redistributing the profits of projected economic demand, while underlying economic processes remain largely unchanged. And why do I suddenly mention this economic argument? Because at the root of these projections of demand through social media platforms is, I suggest, a new myth. A myth about the types of collectivity that we form when we use platforms such as Facebook. An emerging myth of natural collectivity that is essential to the bundle of industries we still call media today. This new myth is particularly seductive because here, media institutions, at least in their normal form, seem to drop out altogether from the picture. It's a story focused entirely on what we do naturally, when we have the chance to keep in touch with each other, as of course we want to do. Indeed, instead of the nation now, David Morley and Charlotte Brunston's great phrase for the 1970s myth of the mediated center, instead of the nation now, we have us now. In an age when Facebook offers, quoting Mark Zuckerberg, to tell the story of our lives. Of course, I'm not claiming that this myth is as yet fully established, just as the myth of the mediated center took decades to become fully established. So the myth of us, the myth of a natural collectivity sustained only through mediated platforms in which social media is a core component, that myth will emerge only fully over time. Joseph van Dijk's recent book, The Culture of Connectivity, brings out the complexity of the competing norms that are currently at work in the multiple proprietary models attempting to dominate the space of social media. It's very complex right now. But as Van Dijk and before her Christian Fuchs have brought out, the drive for profit through the value generated by social interactions online now inclines platform operators to sound like social theorists. It's not by accident that Mark Zuckerberg, in a video roadshow just before the Facebook votation last year, claimed that Facebook, quotes, is a fabric that can make any experience online social. Thanks to Joseph van Dijk for that great quote. I don't know how she found that online somewhere. So Mark Zuckerberg is perhaps our leading social theorist. Can we be relaxed about that? I don't think so. Given this, there's a real risk, quite seriously, there's a real risk of allowing our evaluations as academics and as activists of contemporary activism, its successes and failures, its prospects of really changing things to be influenced by the insidious rhetoric of social media platforms that need for their financial growth, indeed survival, to claim credit for what we do when we use them. Those platforms' language is necessarily inflationary and simplifying. So there's no reason at the outset to regard activities on such platforms within that myth-enveloped space as necessarily political, let alone necessarily radical. Jodie Dean's note of caution about the depoliticizing impact of many contexts of online communication is worth at least taking seriously here. I think she maybe goes a bit far in some of her general statements, but there's an interesting point in her note of suspicion. Put it another way, is there any reason to believe that the spiral of silence, which years ago Noel Newman regarded as discouraging people from uttering unconventional political views to others, has stopped turning when we go online? And that is my worry about Lance Bennett's and Alexandra Siegerberg's argument that there's a general logic of connective action at work on and through social media platforms. There may well be, but that doesn't tell us whether, in ordinary times and for most people, that logic is oriented towards or away from political action, let alone towards or away from positive political action. That's what I don't know. I'm sure you're right, there's a logic of connective action. I'm throwing out a point of debate so that Lance can pick this up tomorrow, but that's my one worry with the argument. Now, that's not to say, of course, that we shouldn't use social media platforms. They are a very effective way of quickly sharing images and reflections from a political event to thousands of people scattered across the world. Nor, of course, is it to say that we shouldn't follow very closely what happens on social media platforms at times of political upheaval. It's just to sound a gentle note of warning to myself as much as to anyone else of the dangers in our thinking about today's media-based activism and protests of simply replaying what the myth of the mediated centre has always done, which is to mistake the part for the whole. Media institutions have always generalized in their own interests from what particular people are saying or feeling, often those closest to journalists themselves, to what the whole nation is thinking or feeling. More subtle versions of the same trap lie in wait for us. First, to assume that those forms of collectivity that become visible to us through social media platforms, which are designed, remember, precisely to make collectivities visible, are typical of the whole of everyday life, of all networks, groups, and individuals. What if they're not? And second, to assume that the special moments when those collectivities reach maximum intensity are typical of the rest of the time when activity may be quiet, or those collectivities may effectively not exist. Put it another way, if we're serious about researching media activism, we have to be as interested in the decay of collectivities online as in their rise. We have to be as interested in the quieter periods of ordinary democracy when people may be using social media platforms for other very different purposes, as in those moments of exceptional distress and anger when Facebook and Twitter spring to life as sites of activism. Now, that might sound like a pessimistic or downbeat view, and I certainly don't want to start the conference in a complaining or miserable way. It's not as if it was sunny outside. We need some joy here. But I hope it's just the opposite of being a depressing starting point. I, too, am deeply excited by the possibilities of digital platforms for political change. But we have to remember first that those platforms are open to anyone, wherever they are in the political spectrum, democratic or anti-democratic, however entrenched their political power. And even more important, we have to remember that political transformations generally occur over a long time scale. Even the most dramatic political turnarounds, such as the multiple revolutions that announced the collapse of the Soviet Union's authority in Eastern Europe in 1989, follow very long periods of latent opposition and hostility, as Jeff Goldfarb's fine book, The Politics of Small Things, brings out. Meanwhile, there are many parts of the world where social media are fast growing, yet are not associated with any political transformation, or associated with political failure, such as Iran's failed revolution of 2009, which has since been followed by an intense increase in the power of conservative forces. That means, I suggest, that the most exciting research we can do now is to look very closely and openly at such processes in the round, at the campaigns which take off and those which don't, at both the banal times and the extraordinary times, drawing on as much historical context and comparative material as we can, and orienting ourselves to the long term, to the long haul. So, as a final inspiration for this task, I want to close by mentioning the English historian E.P. Thompson's work on long-term political transformations. And I swear that Peter and I had no idea what each other were going to talk about. But I will be going back to that period that he mentioned. E.P. Thompson, writing in one of the books that founded British cultural studies, The Making of the English Working Class, Thompson researched the history of the emergence of the English working class over 50 years, 1780 to 1832, the date of the Reform Act which radically changed the voting structure in Britain. And he tracked the emergence in many places and across many networks of a working class that became gradually conscious of itself as a possible agent of social and political change. And towards the end of his great book, he writes about the role in that change of media, particularly newspapers and pamphlets, which we now feel so relaxed about dismissing. He writes about the sacrifices that individuals were prepared to make to circulate ideas and information in those then new forms. He writes that the artisans were profoundly suspicious of an established culture which had excluded them from power and knowledge. A reading public, which was increasingly working class in character, was forced to organize itself. But this took time, many decades, even though it was animated by a great hope of a different future. Thompson quotes one radical publisher, Richard Carlile, who wrote, way back then in the 1830s, that pamphlet reading is destined to work the great, necessary moral and political changes among mankind. The art of printing is a multiplication of mind. For sure, in the digital age, we are in the middle of another great multiplication of mind. But to grasp it, we must have the patience to follow its detailed successes and failures over not just the short, but the longer term. Thanks for listening.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very interesting and provocative talk, Nick. And I'm sure that gives rise to a lot of discussion, so I'll throw the floor open to questions, contributions, so on, to the back.
See what I'm driving at? Yeah, absolutely. Is there a political goal going down?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Could you just tell us who you are before?
Yeah, Stuart Price from the University.
Okay, and can everyone say who they are before they start? Because we've not actually got the metadata on you readily available. Yeah.
Well, we knew each other before, Stuart. It's a very good question. Thanks for that. Well, I deliberately bracketed out where I stood in this, although I implied certain things, I guess, in the way I put it. The clearest, most open statement of my political hopes is in my book on voice, which came before the Media Society World Book, Why Voice Matters, Politics and Culture After Neoliberalism, where I guess my position is that a ever more intensely marketized society and world poses fundamental problems for what we call democracy, that neoliberal democracy, which I think is what we're living through, is an oxymoron. It isn't a democracy. There is no compatibility between the idea that market functioning must be prior and shapes the space of the social, which was the revolutionary idea of the neoliberals that Foucault so brilliantly spotted back in the early 1800s. But of course, we then saw many actual forms in the 70s onwards. There's no compatibility between that idea and the idea of the social as a transformative space where new types of involving democracy might emerge. They're radically incompatible. So, however, I don't, and I'll be open here, I don't have any blueprint as to how society should be reorganized to make voice more possible. I think that's exactly the uncertainty we're living through at the moment. That's not to say that I'm not inspired by socialism. I call myself a sort of socialist, but a skeptical, uncertain, troubled socialist. I don't have any belief in any particular restructuring of the economy that will work and work better. I don't know the answers to that question. I don't believe a lot of people do. But I do think we are now facing a deep crisis in the nature of democracy, which requires radical change. And that's what excited me about the Occupy movement, as I hinted, that this, and as I've written about in a short piece on the SSRC website in New York, that for me was so powerful because it was an attempt to reinvoke the general will, to say that democracy simply is not working. It is not including those who, by definition, it should be including. And precisely not in relation to the most important issues, which is about the reorganization, the organization of economic resources, the disposition of basic chances for quality of life. It's not working. And it's because it wasn't working that they were enabled to start a process of mutual education by those many people who had traveled those questions, who came along even occasionally and took part. That was a profound moment, very difficult to sustain, but it was sustained surprisingly long, and I think it's an interesting one. How was it sustained surprisingly long? But now we know that period is over. So I do have those hopes. They don't come with a program. That's why I tend not to talk explicitly, because I genuinely don't know exactly where we should go. But I do think we are in a deep crisis about the nature of democracy, and because we all care about that, I guess that's why we're here in this room today.
Yeah.
I'm quite, was quite impressed. I think it was a very interesting speech, giving a broad picture of the discussions at the moment. I agree pretty much. There was only the concept of counter democracy by Goodwin. I don't have some clear understanding of what counter democracy. It sounded a little bit for me like typical criticism of protest. That they are only against something. But could you go more into detail? Because in the later parts, it is pretty much about counter movement, about building opposition. So I didn't really understood the criticism point.
Yes, happy to clarify that. I think Roosevelt is a very interesting writer for me because he refuses to take as a given precisely the crude idea that there's no democracy, that democracy is declining. He said, absolutely not true. Under certain definitions, democracy is increasing, more and more effective forms of protest. It's almost impossible to be a scandalous politician now and survive more than a week. These things he recognizes as part of, in a sense, an important increase in democracy, not trivial, not nothing at all. However, he tries to break apart that from the longer-term process of positive, constructive politics, which is necessary for any form of political transformation, if you take that broader political frame, which Stuart was inviting me to bring out. But equally, if you're interested in what he calls ordinary democracy, which was the need just to keep politics going without violence, just to keep talking with each other, to keep deliberating about how you fix your street and so on. That's ordinary democracy, which needs to be more participative in his view, and I agree with him there. And his argument is that that is not necessarily being well served at the moment, and may indeed be even in a crisis of certain sorts. Well, his position is quite complicated, so I will hesitate to summarize what he's saying. And so what I was saying is that he's onto something important there, that if we put all our emphasis on those heady moments of counter-democracy, then we may lose other areas which are not being so well nourished by digital infrastructure, and for various reasons that I went through, which are more mine rather than his, I think could even be more difficult than in the pre-digital era. I don't know if that answers your question. Rosenbauer's position is very complex, but I found it personally very helpful in getting out of that idea of saying, well, either democracy is in decline or it's not. But it's clearly much more complicated than that. He makes that very sharp from the beginning, and that's why I mentioned him.
I'm Lorenzo Bretti from the University of Westminster. At first sight, we could consider communication in social media, patterns of communication in social media to be horizontal. And at the same time, at first sight, we could tend to consider the structure of social movements that use social media to be horizontal as well. Then after analysis, we see that patterns of communication on Facebook, especially on pages, become very vertical. And at the same time, the horizontal structures of social movements hide hierarchies inside. Do you think that we can find a relationship between these two dynamics?
Well, there is a direct relationship, which is economic, which is that the continuation of the platforms that originally, in their first dawn, enabled us unimpededly to be in touch, to be together. Their continuation is based around value, economic value, which is generated through the selling of data, which is based around ensuring that individuals can be tracked as they follow certain messages. The messages that the economic value relies on them following are those of producers of all sorts, including the largest corporations, who are trying to find ways, and it's very difficult for them, to stably target the attention of populations that they're no longer confident they can reach through television or other forms of classic mass marketing. So there's a direct link. The vertical emerges as part of the need of answering that fundamental economic need from one point of view. You could also take a social cultural point of view and leaving the economic to one side and say, well, this is what I tended to emphasize more in my work, because I'm not principally a political economist, so I always rely on what political economy tells us, is that also culturally and symbolically, these platforms work through this myth of bringing us together. And there are no institutions more in control of the terms on which we come together but the large media institutions, those which for a century or more have controlled our languages for how we come together, our metaphors for what it is to come together, our sense of what the reference points are, what's going on, what's important, and so on. So I think even if there wasn't that strong economic driver, there will be another social historic driver to make it clear that those institutions, the old media, would do everything they could to remain powerful in the new situation. That's also vertical, and that's why Twitter, after just a year or two of apparently being a situation, leaving aside protest situations, which arguably are a different configuration, but on a daily basis, we thought originally Twitter was how we could say what breakfast was like for us, and literally everyone could know it. We could mass self-broadcast. But hey presto, we found that the people most actively twittering were the celebrities who needed to retain their celebrity capital. So I don't think there's any accident for a number of reasons for that connection. But the crucial point I'd emphasize is this. The second move, the vertical, can't be effective unless it operates in a social form which has some legitimacy. And that's why I always emphasize the mythical element of political economic structures. I guess that's where I claim in my work to be offering a cultural supplement to political economy, because I believe political economy is right. But then Castells is also right that structures are never fully legitimate and effective unless a cultural forces enables them to have meaning in people's lives. Because we could all of us today decide after today's discussions that we're going to drop Facebook. We're just not going to take part anymore, except in relation to certain platforms that we might be more in control of and that we could use for ends that we do value. We could make that decision. We know more and more people in Britain are moving away from Facebook. But there are intense pressures to do otherwise. And that's where the mythical comes in the sense that we won't be together if we do that. We will have lost something fundamental, that we can't turn our back on ourselves.
I'm from Lakehead University, Canada. I was wondering, I'm interested in Castell's idea of the networked society and this, what you called anarchist self-management, and it made me think about sort of the movements that are actually trying to stay away from corporate platforms, movements like indie media or alternative media centers, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit and whether you think that there's that they offer any kind of real challenge to communicative power.
Yeah, that's again a great question, because I care a lot about alternative media, and a lot of my work has been in relation to alternative and community media. And I think it's absolutely vital to hold on to that hope that there can be other ways of configuring symbolic resources, different infrastructures that could enable much broader, more participatory outcomes. So that is really important. I think it's interesting. I read Castells as being conflicted. If you go back to his early work in the 1970s, his fine book, The City and the Grassroots, he was clearly genuinely very invested in grassroots activism that hit against big urban structures and argued for new forms of change and so on. And he hasn't lost that. He told me that he is an anarchist. He announced at some dinner we were at that I'm an anarchist, which is interesting because I think he means it. He does, and if you read the style, that's what I find so engaging about the way he writes. He does mean the utopian side of what he says. He hasn't lost touch with that. However, I think the problem is that his notion of network society, which he's now invested in, is not quite an oxymoron, because networks can be the basis of the social. But it's problematic, to say the least, because it under-theorizes the very term on which it depends silently, which is society. It doesn't provide an account of society. Now, how might that relate to indie media and other forms of alternative media? Clearly, it's possible that communities of practice can build around alternative platforms, alternative forms of social media, perhaps, alternative ways of circulating what's important in terms of changing structures, the information people need to know to challenge the distribution of resources. They could develop, and under certain conditions, they could develop feedback loops, and they could stabilize, and people could then start to articulate change and not be cut off, but could build from there and link others to them. In Occupy, we had at least the horizon that pointed to that sort of horizon, and it was a network movement that worked fast because the basic idea, the questioning, was so strong. It wasn't exactly alternative media because the websites were not particularly important part of that. And I think one could talk about, as John Postel in an unpublished piece has written about the 15M in Spain and the use of Twitter with a very potent hashtag to draw people in who desperately want change. That isn't a form of alternative media, but of a very, if you like, punctual sort. It's not easy, and I think Juris admits this in his recent article. It's not easy to go from that finger that says go there, gather now, something will happen, to a longer-term program of debate around change, discussions about how resources are distributed and so on. And that's what a longer-term alternative media, community media needs, a space which did for some while develop in some countries around indie media, but not in others, to seriously gather news continuously and exchange the information that people want. But again, that brings out how there are many different types of alternative media structure. Twitter is important, but it's only part of a much bigger alternative information structure, to use the phrase of Jeremy Gilbert, that would have to be built. So all I can say is we have to look for points of hope. And if you have any examples that you find hopeful, please share them, because this is obviously a very hard thing to pull off. Are there any particular examples you've got in mind that you think are hopeful examples of alternative media right now? Yeah, I just wondered whether something you had in mind.
Some of my research is on, well, I've researched mostly in the Canadian context, so there is a kind of like Indie Media 2.0 that's going on across Canada with the Media Co-op, which has restructured itself as a solidarity cooperative and uses crowdfunding to fund itself and is more committed to not just protest coverage, but also in-depth researching. They do a lot of exposés using access to information requests of the government and that kind of thing. So that's one interesting group. But I think I agree with your point that these groups need to be networked with, more globally in order to build up that kind of alternative infrastructure.
Hi, David Gauntlet, University of Westminster. That was so thought-provoking, Nick, and so full of ideas and interesting stuff that I'm only trying to sketch some kind of response. But first of all, generally, I think, obviously, you're right. And also, we should definitely discount Facebook from the start of any conversation like this, because that's just rubbish and everybody's moving away from it anyway. So let's leave things like that aside. But,
1.1 billion.
Thoroughly scientific.
I'm sort of looking for reasons to be optimistic, and other people have been looking for reasons to be optimistic, and I know you like to look for reasons to be optimistic, of course. But if we were to accept your general picture, we wouldn't be feeling that great, I don't think. But I was thinking about possible ways in which we might feel optimistic about what's going on. I was wondering if you might sort of think that the optimistic answer might be about sort of slow shifts in culture. So if you're interpreting politics narrowly, you talked about political stage, political campaigns, things like that, of course, and of course we need to talk about those. And we want to work out how to transform those. But on the other hand, there's this kind of longer shift, perhaps, in who can speak, who's creative, how people can flourish if they can produce and exchange ideas rather than being consumers of ideas. And I was wondering if you sort of think, does it work to interpret politics that broadly? Do you think that makes sense? You mentioned E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson was a fan of William Morris. William Morris was all about people transforming their lives through having a creative voice. So I think we can possibly find reasons to be optimistic if we interpret politics in the broad cultural sense, where people are able to now do things and not just be consumers. But do you think that takes the focus too far away from politics?
No, not at all. And that goes back to Stuart's first question, which is the side of my work that I didn't talk about because of time. But my book on voice is exactly looking in those broader areas. So I think that's absolutely right. And of course, E.P. Thompson's book is an optimistic book in one sense. It is the story of a success, the emergence of a political actor. Maybe we look back on it rather sadly now because of the fate of working class politics since he wrote it, but that was not part of his original intention and hope. It was an optimistic book, but operating on a radically different time scale from the one that we have got used to operating on, which is also the time scale of Facebook time and so on. But you said a really interesting thing, shifts in culture. I think that's absolutely the heart of it, the culture of politics. And that's the good thing about Castell's argument. He does insist it's not just a technical fix. There has to be a cultural change. I think he's just misled in looking for the cultural change and misled by psychological and brain science and other models which imply that we just have to be reprogrammed in some way, which is, to say the least, a violent short-circuiting of his cultural insight. But the way I put it is this, that I do think there was something very hopeful about the Occupy movement. I myself was inspired by it, to write a short piece at least. And I think what was inspiring about it was not only the people came together, because they have been doing that for 200 or 300 years, but they came together for a slightly different type of purpose, which was to re-educate themselves about what politics felt like, what politics was, what sort of questions had to be asked if you were being political. And for a period that really caught on. I was very struck, because I think it's one thing to say, well, that had a lot of impacts on the left and in academia, of course it did. But it was also very interesting in the mainstream media in Britain, how Occupy London got picked up. Not just the Financial Times, which mentioned it in a few editorials, but the Evening Standard, not, as you know, the Free newspaper, not that fount of radicalism in Britain. Though I once saw a sort of rather popular, pleasant sort of article about someone who wrote for a fashion magazine, talking about her day, this was day in the life sort of piece, her day at Occupy, or her night at Occupy, because she was working by day at the fashion magazine, but she thought, oh, it's cool, I'll just go down there. I won't stay there overnight because I've got a few other things to do. And that's good, because she didn't need to upend the whole of her life in order to be political. But she went down for a few hours because she thought she needed to be there to find out what was being talked about and contribute to that. That struck me, microscopic though it was, as extremely interesting. That, unlike with the appalling treatment of Greenham Common and the other great protest movements of the recent past, to be an acceptable metaphor for political action. It became acceptable to go down to some central place and talk to others about what should be done. Not just stand there and march, but to talk about what should be done. Now, that repertoire of collective action, and I didn't talk about that because I was less concerned with political action, more with the media interface. Using Tilly's term, that repertoire of political action was changed to some degree by Occupy, I think. They developed a new thing we can do together that can disrupt at least temporarily. But the other side of it we have to pay attention to is, well, what would have to happen for that to multiply, to grow? And the other side of it surely is that other forms of politics have to become delegitimated, have to become less meaningful, less worth putting our time into. And I'm not in favor of getting rid of the whole political structure, but I think the current apathy and disaffection with conventional political forms has to go from a disaffection, which may lead to nothing, to a sense that actually that is not right. That is not the appropriate way to generate political responses to this deep economic or even ecological crisis. So the positive has to be matched with a rejection of something we've taken for granted for a very long time. That, as far as I know, hasn't yet happened, except in small groups. And that's what's needed, I think, for something larger to happen. And that Occupy didn't achieve that, in my view. I could be wrong. But I think that's still hopeful, because that first move that Occupy made was already a huge step forward that we hadn't seen for some time.
I want to ask two questions, please. One question is about the paradigm level, whether we are seeing the collapse of the neoliberal paradigm, as you say. Are we seeing parallel processes of reconstruction in the Habermasian sense of modernism, lively processes and elements of modernism, thus rejecting the postmodern discourse in the Jameson sense, that are this discourse, also the discourse on the new media, is masking the social, historical processes. The second question is whether we can, if we map cognitive maps for research, let's say, for instance, can we think about the neoliberal paradigm, its global effects, embedded in local, national kind of political economy, in democratic and also totalitarian regimes, and we can see that we have a specific effects, local specific effects, but I think that we have also general global lost generation. We are talking about generations also. We have lost generation in every country, that there were uprisings even in the Arab world and in Russia and Canada, and there was the alliance of the parents or the older generation that through these young people see the dead end of some of them are parents, some of them are the 60 generation, that they see the dead ends of these contemporary conditions. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks for very thoughtful questions. I think your second one is difficult. It's common to talk of a lost generation because of the economic circumstances and rising unemployment and so on, and the disappearance of any clear sense of how the global economy should be organized, how we can get a better relationship to the finance system that underpins everything we do, that is less oppressive, less exploitative. So I don't really have any answers to that. That's too large a question. But the first point you made, the sort of double point, are we seeing that you implied, I think that I'm saying we're seeing the collapse of the neoliberal paradigm. I don't think we are. It looked that way very briefly in late 2008 when the financial system was within days of collapse. And there was a lot of statements of fear issuing from all sorts of directions, of course. But that did stabilize, and I think we haven't seen a withdrawal. If you look at current government policies and rhetoric in Britain and many other countries, we haven't seen a withdrawal of neoliberalism as a policy regime. It remains very much in force. In Britain, we don't have an effective challenge to it. Even though the political opportunity is there, we simply don't have that challenge. So I think the neoliberal paradigm remains in force. But nonetheless, as you say, there may be processes of reconstruction. You say reconstruction of modernism and rather than postmodernism. I agree with you. I've never found the notion of postmodernism very helpful. I don't believe we were ever in a postmodern age. Most people now don't refer to it, so it's as if it was washed away by the tide. I don't think it ever existed, but we certainly lived in a point where cultural transformations took an interesting point of self-reference. They were worth talking about, but they were not a cultural logic in the way Jameson said. So I think we are looking at ever new versions of the crisis and modernity, but the direction of travel isn't clear. So much is not changing, but certain pressure points are building and facing more and more, generating more and more incoherences. The gap at the moment is that from those incoherences, which are becoming increasingly clear to people and no longer just in relation to the environment, where we know we can't go on living as we are, to the political and economic sphere, where we're starting to realize we can't go on not acting politically as we do, and not changing the economic stride without disaster, but we have no idea what the alternatives are at this point. There's no broader consensus about that, and even in countries such as Britain, which are flourishing democracies in many ways, even the beginnings of articulating what those alternatives might be. So it's very difficult. You're asking really about the direction and how we think. It's very difficult to know what the direction is at the moment. I can't say much more than that, but thanks for your question. Well, we are interfering with start, but I agree, but of course, absolutely. We need to be as clear as we can in intervening. Yes. Okay,
if I could...
I'll be a bit briefer.
We have two more questions, of which I'm going to take one, yes? So you're the last question from the floor, yeah?
So please, you made, you said that there's a danger of the parts being seen as the whole. So how will you appraise the situation in maybe, let's say, developing world in terms of where the internet and social media have been used as a platform for, let's say, deliberative democracy, where previously only the state, the ruling elite, and those with corporate power have access to free speech, what you see in the West. How will you appraise the whole scenario in terms of deliberative and participatory democracy in that respect?
And could you just tell us who you are?
Okay, my name is Paul Obi. I'm from Cardiff University.
Well, that's a very important point, and the line of argument I was pursuing was trying to re-steer, if you like, a certain line of argument, particularly referring to digital media's influence on developed democracies, if you excuse the term. Now, things may look different when we change the set of reference points and look at the Philippines, look at India, look at Hong Kong, and so on, look at Africa, look at Latin America. And I agree with that, and there just wasn't time to encompass that. And that's exactly why I said we need more comparison. We need to, but the comparison, all I'm saying is that the comparisons have to be grounded in a realistic appreciation of what the potential of digital platforms is, not a hype. That's all I'm saying. So I agree that if your starting point is the impossibility of speaking, let's say, about women's rights or gay rights or whatever, the absolute impossibility under a previous system, and it becomes possible to raise the issue, to be visible temporarily and create influence in countries where that has not been possible before, that is a huge difference. And I'm not minimizing that for a moment. And that could lead to major change. But I guess my argument would be, well, at the moment that just tells us about disruptive, interruptive action. The question has to be, even in relation to those countries as well, how will you then build a bigger political movement on those sort of starting points? I know people are starting to look at that. That is really crucial. So thanks for raising that. That's an important corrective to what the sort of emphasis I was giving. Thank you.
Okay, if I can just finish by asking a question myself, which is, I liked most of what you said. I liked most of your, interrogation of some of the sort of conventional wisdom on these things. And obviously, I liked E.P. Thompson at the end. Yes, sucker for E.P. Thompson at any time. Yeah. But what worried me is that most of your discussion, and you kept on talking about this thing, the digital age. Yeah. Yeah. And most of your discussion took place within the digital age, posing, contradictions, how one might look at it. And I was struck on a whole number of occasions by actually the sort of references that are demanded should go back way before the digital age, and what is this digital age? So, for instance, you quoted the thing, it was the longest bit of history you went back, 20 years ago, someone talking about complexity. Yeah, the problems of dealing with complexity in the media. Well, Walter Lippmann was talking about that in the 1920s in public opinion. Yeah. Or you talk about what inspired you politically, the Occupy movement. Well, fine, but what inspired me was the May events in France in 1968, which had a lot of counter politics, very massive involvement of people. What the nature of what was politics and so on, a whole number of things which people often rather carelessly attribute to the digital age. Well, I could give a lot more examples, but just one last one. You talked about is neoliberalism. Yeah, well, perhaps are we talking about the neoliberal age, not the digital age? So I suppose the question I'd like to ask you, when you use the term digital age, do you think that's a scientific category that characterises our age, and sort of, an even unfairer question, if so, when did it begin? Or are there alternatives?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that. I don't use the word with any great emphasis at all. I just use it because I think we know some of the debates we're dealing with in this room, and they are the ones which precisely assume there is some new Hegelian moment of history, which is the digital age. I don't agree there is such a period, and my book emphasises a lot of continuities. And in fact, you're being provocative, you actually picked up certain, I mentioned many. I mentioned 1789, I mentioned the Iraq War 10 years ago, Iraq War protest 10 years ago, and of course I did mention E.P. Thompson quite deliberately. But the point you make is a really serious one, that how do we, and many people have made this research, how do we get out of this presentism at a time when the data of politics is massively expanded too, because we can read what people do on Twitter. We don't have to have planted microphones in a pub to find out what people have been saying politically in Spain, the Philippines. So there seems, and this is a Bourdieuian sort of point, there seems to be so much more to talk about. And a lot of it relates to precisely the platforms which present things to us as to be talked about. As Bourdieu pointed out, that you have to always sociologize the process that enabled you to be in the position of analyzing this. And in this case, there are economic factors which are crucial to the availability of this as data now. So I think it's vitally important to get out of presentism and to see the continuities. And I think, as you say, in many ways, the debates we're having about whether media platforms in some form or other can or cannot support anything resembling democracy are very old. And this was Nicholas Garland's point in his book, Emancipation, the Media and Modernity, which I think was really important, going back to Kant and Schiller's debate in the late 18th century. These are at least 200 years old, these debates. They did not have solutions then. They don't have solutions now. So for purposes of argument, I was making a certain emphasis, but I absolutely agree with you. And we do need to go right back. And we need to go back preserving a wide-angled lens or historically, a long time scales we need to think about. That's why I emphasized E.P. Thompson's 50-year span at the end. That's the sort of span we need to be thinking about, I believe. So thank you for your question. You're absolutely right.
Okay, on that consensual note, I think we'll bring this session out. I'd like to thank Nick very much for an extremely interesting and stimulating talk. Now, we have a coffee break now, which is downstairs in the Chiltern Hall, where you got your coffee beforehand, those of you who are there. So all the way downstairs at Chiltern Hall. That's half an hour, and then after that, you have to choose which session you're going to. Session 1A is in room M321. Session 1B is in M322. So half an hour coffee break, and then two rooms to go to.
It might not be half an hour if you're running a few minutes late, so it might be about 20 minutes.
Yeah, we're on time. It does. It says 11:15. Yeah.
That's why I was relaxed in my answers to questions. I thought it was very generous. Very generous.
Remember, Helen, I'm the person who went to the wrong building. Yeah. Well, it's fine. We ended it exactly on time.
Well, you're quite right.
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah. So we got it. We ended it on time.
It's 11 o'clock. Going okay?
Yeah, it's extremely good. And I mean, we had 80 people with. Now look, for a computer.